Good afternoon, everyone. So, over the next 2 decades, roughly 350 million young Africans are going to be entering the labor force, looking for work. This age pyramid shows you that 62% of Africa's population is below the age of 25. So 350 million people over the next 2 decades, that's more people than the entire population of the United States. Under the most favorable projections about non-farm employment growth, roughly half of that 350 million can be absorbed into non-farm wage employment. That means that roughly 175 million, the half of all the young Africans entering the job market, are going to be dependent to some extent on agriculture as either a primary or a secondary source of their livelihood. I think that focuses all of us on the severity of this problem that Milu and Derek have been talking about. So I'd like to talk, I'm going to mention 6 conclusions from our work. I think there's quite a bit more than that. Milu has touched on quite a bit of it. Derek's touched on quite a bit of it. There's 6 residual conclusions I'd like to highlight here before we turn it over for Q&A. The first one is that when you fly over Africa, it looks sparsely populated. There's a lot of unexploited land under there, but this masks humongous diversity, both within countries and between countries. So let's talk first about between countries. Derek and Klaus Deininger, in a very nicely done and well-cited piece, have shown that about half, or a little bit more than half, of all of the remaining unutilized land in the world is in Sub-Saharan Africa. But look at how concentrated this is. 9 countries have over 90% of that or unutilized land in Africa. So here we have the DRC Congo over here, Angola, and those 2 countries alone have over half of all of the unutilized land in Africa. And then you go down the list, and by the time you get to the 9th country, you're over 90% of all the unutilized land remaining. So there's 54 countries in Africa. So that means that about 45 remaining countries in Africa have very limited land resources for expansion, despite the fact that the continent overall has great land resources. So that's the between country variation. Now let's look at within country variation. Here's Zambia, one of the least densely populated countries in Africa. And as you can see, up and down the chord, this is kind of a high veld area here, where most of the smallholder agriculture is based, right in here. Also the eastern highlands here of Chipata. These are in escarpments. If you would happen to kind of go, 1 inch this way, you're down in lowland valleys that aren't very hospitable to agriculture. So there's a very logical explanation for settlement patterns that we see here. Kenya is even more extreme. This is kind of towards the upper, higher population density estimates. For those of you who know Kenya, most of this is pastoral, not hospitable for intensive cropping and so forth. So most of the rural people who are dependent on agriculture are very highly populated. In Kenya, there's a word called rural slums. People refer to rural slums, and they almost look like that. Just postage stamp-sized farms, people very dependent on non-farm, petty trading, hawking, selling cigarettes on roadsides. That's not the kind of non-farm employment growth that Schengen is referring to when he's talking about stepping out. Okay? But nevertheless, a large proportion of rural Africans are dependent on such kind of non-farm employment because exacerbated by land constraints. So the second conclusion is that there's a very interesting phenomenon that we've noticed in the last 10, 15 years, the rise of medium-scale farms. Let me show you by using Zambia, which each year collects nationally representative farm survey data every year. So in 2001, we've been able to collect data in 2009, 2012. We divided the farm sample into farm size. So this is 0 to 2 hectares. This is 2 to 5 hectares, I think 5 to 10, 10 to 20, and then 20 to 100. They don't go over 100. You can't really get any statistically valid representation beyond 100 hectares. But even within, let's look at what's happened in this 10-year period. 95% of the farmers in Zambia were smallholders farming between 0 and 2 hectares in 2001. 10 years later, they've been rising at an annual growth rate of 17%, or sorry, an overall growth rate of 17%. But it's the bigger farms that are growing rapidly. And even this farm size from 20 to 100, they weren't even recording such farms. There were so few of them 10 years ago. But now there's almost an exponential growth rate in these large farms. So that's the first thing.
They're African-owned rather than African.
These are mostly African-owned. Yeah, almost entirely African-owned. I'm going to talk about the characteristics of them in just a moment. The other, the next thing I'd like to point out to you is that when you add up the landholding sizes under the control of each of these categories of farms, over half of all of the farmland in Zambia is now in the hands of people between 5 and 100 hectares. This is a dramatic change in farm structure. 10, 15, 20 years ago, almost every single African country, most of the farmland was under the control of small-scale farms, except for South Africa and Zimbabwe, where there was a heavy, large-scale colonial settlement. But these are African-owned farms that are now becoming the majority in between 5 and 200 hectares, 5 and 100 hectares. A slightly unfortunate conclusion is that when you look at how intensively they're utilizing their land, so this is the ratio of area cultivated over area owned. If they, 91% of all of the area owned by small farms between 0 and 2 hectares is cultivated. But by the time you get down to the very bottom, the largest farms, only 11% of their farmland is actually cultivated right now. So that has some very interesting implications as well. We did work like this in 3 countries. We're in the process of doing it in about 3 other ones. So the evidence base is still being formed on this. But in every single country we've looked at right now, we've seen fairly dramatic growth in the medium scale sector. Those of you who are kind of keeping, you've heard in the news that African agriculture is growing rapidly. For the last 10 years or so, average agricultural growth rates have been 5, 6%. Looks pretty good. That's a pretty impressive growth rate. I wonder when you disaggregate that growth, how broadly based is it? And I'm going to point over here just to be fair. This is the group of farms greater than 5 hectares. This is the group that's 0 to 2 hectares, 2 to 5, I think, 5 to 10. These are small farms. Almost all of the action in terms of agricultural growth and commercialization is in the top 10% of the farms, ranked by farm size. So I worry a little bit about that we shouldn't get too sanguine about the fact that there's fairly impressive agricultural growth occurring in Africa without disaggregating it to understand how, who's really benefiting here, how widely shared is that agricultural growth. The third conclusion, that even though we know that medium-scale farms are growing rapidly, as I've said, but it now looks like they're exceeding the amount of land that large-scale farms control, including foreign investors. So one of the articles in the special issue by George Schonewald tried to, I think he's done the most comprehensive job of estimating the land that's been acquired by foreign investors over the past 15 years. And these are the numbers that he's come up with. We've added to this large settler farms in these areas too, and state farms, large-scale farms. So these are the millions of hectares. Let's take Zambia to start with. 2.1 million hectares devoted to large-scale agriculture, including foreign investors. Medium-scale farms have already surpassed that. Same thing in Kenya. Same thing in Ghana. So while the international media has done, I think, a service in highlighting the extent of changes in farm structure in Africa due to foreign investment, that this other, under the radar screen, there's been massive growth in farmland acquisitions in this medium scale. So who are these farmers? What are their characteristics? Let me start out by saying that there has been income growth in urban areas, especially at the top. So the top 5% or so, there's no question that many of the top part of the income distribution has enjoyed greater incomes. And those people are logically looking for places to invest their savings, just like everyone. And ever since 2008, it appears that land has been a very attractive investment since food prices have gone up. So when you look at the characteristics, and this is work that Nick Sitko and Chewe Nkonde have done in Zambia, Milu Moyanga in Kenya, and so forth, we're getting more evidence on this all the time, is that in most countries, I'm going to talk about the caveat here too, are urban-based people. They're salaried people. Many of them work for the public sector, relatively highly educated. When you ask them about how much land their parents had, they had a lot of land, primarily men. I hesitate maybe to call these people elites, but certainly they're not characteristic of your average urban, or rural person. The contrasting case is Ghana, and I see one of the authors of this work in the audience here. In central and northern Ghana, this is basically IFPRI work. It looks like most of the people in medium-scale farming right now did start out as small-scale farmers. Interesting. Not the case in Eastern and Southern Africa so far. Northern Ghana is a relatively land-abundant setting. So I think one of the questions that we all have, all of us who are concerned with these issues, we have to think about is most of Africa, is it characterized by what's happening in northern Ghana, central Ghana? It might be. That would be a very optimistic scenario, because this would show that small-scale farmers really can break through the barriers that are limiting them right now and move into more commercialized agriculture. I think that's how I would characterize the Ghana results. Or do we see the more negative conclusions where there's almost an urban elite takeover of land in rural areas that's being sort of driven by moneyed people in urban areas? The jury's still out, but this is an important question. The fourth conclusion is that not only do medium-scale farms control more land than large-scale, but they also control more land than small-scale. I think I've mentioned this already. In Ghana, it's not, these numbers don't show it. Here's the land under the control of medium-scale farms, 4.2 million hectares in Ghana, for example. But this survey was done in 2005. So if you take account of that meteoric trajectory that I showed you before about the growth of medium-scale farms, chances are very high that they've already surpassed small scale in terms of land. In Zambia, they already do 2.5 million hectares under the control of medium scale, compared to only 2 under the control of small scale. So what I've done here is added up, this last column is the total area under the control of large scale, medium scale, and small scale farms. So these are the numbers of area that's now allocated. I'm going to replicate those numbers next to the amount of potential available cropland that's still remaining. This is the work that Derek had put on the board here earlier. Jordan Chamberlain led one of our studies in this special issue that basically extends the work that Klaus Deininger and Derek Byerly had done, where they're estimating the potential unutilized land in Africa. And when you compare the amount of land that's already been allocated with that that's remaining, you see that most of that land is already under control. And in Kenya's case, for example, there's only about 20% remaining that hasn't been allocated. In Zambia, the picture looks quite a bit better, and so forth. But this gives you an idea of how much land is remaining unallocated in comparison to what's already been allocated. And so this leads me to the fifth conclusion, which is that the amount of land available for continued cropland expansion is limited, significant, but limited. It also varies greatly between countries. DRC Congo, of course, there's millions and millions of hectares of lowland, largely tropical farmland available. When you go to Uganda, you go to Kenya, you go to Rwanda, it's a completely different story. Okay, our sixth conclusion is rising concentration. We basically computed Gini coefficients during the early samples from, let's say, the 1990s or early 2000s, compared that to more recent nationally representative surveys. And you see a fairly dramatic increase in the Gini coefficients over this time. Now, they're not nearly reaching the latifundia South American sort of Ginis. Those were 0.8, 0.9 even in some cases. But they're significantly higher than the ones that we see in Asia, where they were 0.3, maybe up to 0.4 in India and South Asia and so forth. So and the trend that we're seeing is moving in the direction towards something like a latifundia system. So I think we kind of have to take account of how farm structure is fairly dramatically shifting, and very quickly too. The length of time between these surveys is usually 10 or 15 years. So let me summarize. Number one, I have six conclusions. That medium-scale farms are growing at 10 times the rate of small scale. So within 10 years, 1 or 2 decades, they may be the dominant, by far, the dominant scale of farming in sub-Saharan Africa if current trends continue. Second, despite the international media's focus on large-scale land grabs, which is, of course, a very loaded term, more farmland is owned by medium-scale farms than large-scale. And even more land is controlled by medium-scale than small-scale farmers in 2 of the 3 cases. Number 4, and this is very interesting, one of the pitfalls of looking at means. If you look at the median farm size, they're generally declining. So the average farmer, because of subdivision and so forth, the farm for most farmers are experiencing a decline in farm size even when the means are rising. Why are the means rising? Because there's the medium scale farms with 100 hectares, even though there's only 5% of them, they're really increasing the means overall. So we're seeing declines in the medians, at the same time we're seeing rising mean farm size. Higher concentration of landownings, and that the potential for cropland expansion in some cases is quite, there's great opportunities for continued allocation of land. In other cases, there is not. And so I think this raises, in some countries, the feasibility of continued large-scale and medium-scale land acquisitions. There's lots of issues associated with this. So before we hand it over to Q&A, let me just raise 4 policy questions that seem important to us. Number 1, yes, the region as a whole is enjoying fairly impressive agricultural growth. Who's driving this growth? How broadly based and inclusive is it? Does it matter? Number 2, as I started off with the employment challenge, 350 million Africans entering the labor market and non-farm not being able to drive most of this, to absorb these 350 million people. Do we have to think about land policy in a way to allow the other 175 million to have an opportunity for livelihoods through land policy? Maybe more broadly, let me ask this question. Most of the agricultural strategies of African countries are mute about the ability to expand land, expand land. So they basically implicitly assume that its smallholder-based expansion can continue without any constraints on access to land. I'm not sure that's the case for many African countries. Same thing with poverty reduction strategies. There's really nothing in there about failure to access land. What do we need to do about that? Number 3, does the rate of non-farm employment growth depend on how inclusive agricultural growth is? If the rate of non-farm job growth can continue unabated without depending on the multipliers from agriculture, then I would, agree with or lend more weight to Paul Collier's arguments that, he doesn't see much future for smallholder agriculture and that we should kind of give up on, romanticizing that scenario. I wonder whether non-farm employment growth, especially for non-tradables, can proceed without a broad-based structure of agricultural growth. If that's the case, does land policy have does that imply anything about land policy for us? And lastly, does a commitment to inclusive agricultural development require area expansion and a change in land allocation policy? So ladies and gentlemen, with those remarks, let me thank you very much for your time.